and we greatly look forward to what both of you have to say about electoral systems. Merci beaucoup de vous être libéré.
Thank you very much for taking the time to join us in this last week of July. It is very much appreciated. We will surely greatly benefit from everything that you have to say this afternoon. Without further ado, shall we start with Professor Russell for 20 minutes?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank members of the committee for giving me an opportunity to share my ideas with you on this important, very important topic you are working on. And I congratulate all 12 of you for working on this committee and devoting some real time. And I guess not just time, it's this head you got to really apply. There's some complicated questions when you get down to alternatives. So I'm here today to, in a kind of, making a kind of one-dimensional, I suppose, pitch to you. And it's set out in my paper, which I'll just skim through. But my one-dimensional pitch is that the one thing, the top thing, the key thing that your committee's recommendations should point towards is creating a House of Commons that represents the political preferences of the people. Now that's quite an idea, isn't it? Imagine an elected assembly representing the people and their political choices. There are many other values as concerns that go into an electoral system, and they've been set out in various documents to you: accessibility, simplicity, blah, blah, blah. But members of Parliament on this committee, if your recommendations did not really address this fundamental concern about making our Parliament represent the people, you might do very well on some of the other concerns, but you'll be a failure. You would be a failure, because your job is to really deliver recommendations that can make us a representative democracy. That's what we're supposed to be. So that's what I'm all about and all over. In my paper, I try to explain briefly why the first past the post system, which Canada's had from Confederation until today at the federal level, no longer fits the political circumstances of the country and has not done so since 1921. Why 1921? 1921, he said. Yeah, I said 1921. That's when things changed. What changed? From 1921 on, we did not have a two-party system. Up until 1921, two parties. Do the math. One's going to have a majority and the other's not. You're going to get governments that pretty well represent the people. No problem, no issue. Of course it was a natural for our founding fathers. There were no mothers, but for the founding fathers. But then in 1921, when the Conservatives under Arthur Main actually came third and the Progressives second to Mackenzie King's Liberals, from that time on, we've had a multi-party system, mostly 4 or 5 parties, and they do not, kind of party system is really torpedoed, it's undermined by a first past the post system. And you can see that clearly when you look at the top of page 2, where I give you the results of elections since 1921, federal elections. It's 1921. We've had 30 30 elections at the federal level since 1921. 14 produced false majority governments. I'm going to come back and defend my use of that term and explain it. But basically, it's governments with a majority of seats in the House of Commons, but not supported by a majority of the people. We've had that. That's been the most frequent result, false majority governments. Just behind it, 13 times we've had minority governments. And only 3 times in 30 elections have we had what you could call a true majority government, a government led by a party that won 50% or more of the seats, but also, most significantly, 50% of the popular vote. It was always just over 50. Diefenbaker's landslide in 1958, Mackenzie King in the war, 1940, and Brian Mulroney in 1984. But they're very exceptional. And if you look at our so-called majority governments in the last sort of period since the late 80s, no government with a majority has had more than 43% of the popular vote, but has had a majority of seats in the House of Commons and been in position to control really what happens there and to control government. Indeed, today, 43%, my goodness, party leaders, liberals and conservatives, they salivate when they hear that number. They haven't got close to it in recent years. They haven't even hit the 40 mark in the last couple of elections that have produced majority governments. And so, as I say in paragraph 7, as a parliamentary democracy, Canada surely can do better than being most often governed by politicians who were not the first choice of 60% of the people, but that have the power to control Parliament. Electoral reforms should, above all, be directed at that situation. That's the #1 target I think your committee should have. I go on to talk about some of the concerns people have, in a way, about what I've just said. I hang out in South Rosedale with liberals and conservatives, and they're not very interested in electoral reform. And when I tell them it will almost guarantee that no party will have a majority in Parliament, they gasp in horror. Oh my God! Oh my God! We got to have a majority in Parliament, and that seems. Because I start the conversation by saying, wouldn't you like to have a House of Commons that represents the people, the political preferences of the people? Oh, yes, of course. Oh, yeah, give me that. I mean, that's what democracy is all. Oh, Peter, you mean to say where they have this sort of system, some proportionality, that makes the elected assembly reflect the political choice of the people? They don't have majority governments? No, I'm afraid they don't. It's very rare. And why is that? Well, we don't have any popular political parties anymore, not really popular. Popular parties are rare breeds. By popular, I mean 50% or more of the population in any of the Western democracies, not just here, everywhere. People have got very different views, not just Tweedledum and Tweedledee, Tories and Liberals. They've got many different ideas. And if a country's electoral system and system of representative democracy doesn't respond to that reality, and we haven't for nearly a century, it's really not delivering the kind of representative democracy people need. And so with my neighbors and my friends, and they're good people, who are alarmed, parliaments with no majority, and they shiver and they have hair that stands on end. I say, well, now look. And then what they sometimes do right away is say, Italy and Israel. We'll be like Italy and Israel. Actually, they haven't kept up with Italy. If they did, they know it's gone almost the reverse of proportional representation, and Israel has no threshold for its smallest parties. But what they don't know is almost all of the parliamentary democracy world, that's the world that the countries that practice parliamentary democracy, have some system of proportional representation that represents the political divisions in the country fairly accurately, and they rarely ever have a majority government. They have minority governments or coalitions. Now once you get that out, then you've got to say, what are those countries? Well, they're, messy old countries like the Netherlands and Germany and New Zealand. And you can reel off, and I do in my paper and my book, Two Cheers for Minority Government, a dozen or more countries that have governed themselves extremely well with no government having a majority of seats in the parliament. In my book, I also look at how this has worked out in Canadian history. In my book, Two Cheers for Minority Government, I take the minority governments we had from 1921 up until publication in 2006. I do a profile. Mackenzie King had 3. I go up and I do Diefenbakers and Pearsons and Kings and Clarks, a disaster at that one, and Stephen Harper's. And what I hope I show, and there's lots of evidence in the book, these were pretty darned effective governments. They really did get things done. It wasn't a matter of being stalemated and crippled and feeble. Some of the most dynamic governments we've had. I take a look at some of the provincial situations where there's been no majority in a legislative assembly, and how productive governments have often been in the provinces. My model is Davis's 6 years. Bill Davis's Conservatives had a minority situation through the 70s right up to 1981, and it was an era of tremendous reform and accomplishment for Ontario. Most of the time, Mr. Davis's Conservatives reached out to Stephen Lewis's NDP, and they put together a really interesting program of policy reform for the province of Ontario. So my point here is to underline that those screams of horror at the prospect of no single party having a majority in Parliament, you should be able to deal with those with evidence. People these days, we've got a very good, well-educated population. Evidence-based thinking is, I hope, really on these days. Ask them to look at the evidence, not just little tidbits they've heard about Israel and Italy, but the evidence. They can start with my book. I don't have to start there, but it's the only book on minority parliaments in the English-speaking world right now. But look at the evidence before they lose sleep over the possibility of a proportional representation system giving us no majority in Parliament. I go on in the paper to say, besides governments based on what I call minority parliaments, parliaments in which no party is a majority, Parliament itself works better. There's lots of evidence about that when no party is in a position to really control it. When there's a real incentive just really to survive, to put together policies that accommodate more than the plurality party in the House. I think a textbook example, in my opinion, was the first year of Stephen Harper's first minority government. He didn't have a natural ally in the House of Commons, an opposition party that was that close to his party, but he managed to reach out on policy after policy, foreign and domestic, to different parties, to put together policies that were not an abandonment of conservative positions, but a modification and adjustment of them, and at the same time got through 4 of his 5 election priorities. More often, minority parliaments have two parties that can be more natural allies. My point is that minority parliaments in which no party is a majority, can produce strong and effective government, but also, and this is so important, they can make Parliament really matter, really be significant from the time it meets until the next election. And it's difficult to say that about parliaments in the past, not the present one, but have been dominated by a false majority government. I promise to explain the falseness. The only reason I call a majority government that hasn't been supported by the majority of the people, I call it false, is because I've seen several times people voted us in. That is, excuse me, members of the public, BS. They did not. And that leads to that arrogance that is just lethal in a parliamentary democracy. And I will give up calling them these false majority parliaments when their leaders give up saying we've got a direct mandate from the people. Now, just a word or two about minority government versus coalition governments. I have a section on that, and I prefer minority government to coalition on the whole, and I think most Canadians do. We have not had since 1921 a coalition government. We had one just before 1921, Robert Borden's Unionist coalition, but that was a wartime effort when the Liberals split. And I think the advantage of minority government over a majority coalition, and let me pause to underline, you probably know this, coalitions can be minority coalitions. The one that Mr. Layton and Mr. Dion planned in 2008, put together, would have been a minority coalition. But the advantage let me put it another way, the disadvantage in terms of parliamentary life of a coalition is most of the give and take, the reaching out and making broader policies that are more inclusive, takes place in a coalition when the leaders negotiate their deal that brings the two parties together to share cabinet positions. And after that, a majority coalition can be as dominating of a parliament as a false majority government. We saw that most recently with Cameron and Clegg, I think, in the United Kingdom. So I, on the whole, prefer the minority government solution. Now, let me acknowledge that the downside, I think, to minority parliaments is the danger of too many votes in the House of Commons, because confidence votes, when you have them often, they create a sort of crisis-to-crisis situation. If every vote becomes a matter of the government's survival, you get a crisis situation in the House of Commons. Some of you experienced that. You really don't get any interesting and collegial-like cooperation in making policy. And I worry about that. But my answer is that under an electoral system that's proportional, I think there's less likely to be a lot of votes of confidence. You get a lot of votes of confidence when there's a real good possibility you can bring the government down, have an election, and get a majority. And oh boy, the party leaders, and I'll be very blunt, Liberal leaders and Conservative leaders, they love majorities. Life is a lot easier. But it's more than that. With Liberals and Conservatives, the gold standard of a leader's success is winning a majority. And that's the way the public and the media sort of gauge them. He hasn't got a majority yet. He's not really been a great conservative or a great liberal leader. And I think when you change your electoral system to suit a country in which no party is very popular, in which getting 40% is really as hard as you'll get, I think that culture will change. And the people will realize, the media will realize, political leaders will realize, just bringing down a government to force an election is not very smart, because you really don't know what's going to happen with a system that really does accurately reflect the views of the people. One reform, as parliamentarians, I urge you to think about in this context, is what some of the European parliamentary democracies that have PR have developed, and that is the constructive non-confidence vote. That non-confidence votes require, and this has to be in your parliamentary rules, the Speaker would have to enforce this, require that the mover attach to the non-confidence vote a choice of the next government leader. They say, support my motion to bring the government down, and support this political leader, usually the leader of his own party, still be a minority party. And what happens then is, if you bring government down, you have another government, another combination of political parties that can produce a government, a minority government, that can survive in the House of Commons. And European parliamentary democracies with proportional representation have found that's a very good stabilizing device. And that's entirely in your hands. That would be something that a House of Commons, having adopted a proportional representation system, would, I think, want to look at carefully.
Professor Russell, these are fascinating, these are great ideas. These are original ideas that we have not heard to this point. And I'm sure there are going to be many questions for you to explore them further. Would it be okay if we went to...
I'm just going to give you one more prayer. I'm going to almost pray. I get down on my hands and knees, because this is just a stabilizing reform. It's my last one, Mr. Chair, if you do change the electoral system. And I think most of the public here don't know what I'm just going to say. We're virtually the only parliamentary democracy in the world which really has no rule about when Parliament should meet after an election. Think of that. We do have, you have to have a Parliament has to have a session once a year. But that means after the election, when people say, well, when's Parliament going to meet? I don't know. And that's particularly dangerous when no party has a majority. And there the public, and indeed the international community, saying, well, who's in charge in Canada? Oh, hell, we won't know until Parliament meets, because you have to have a majority in Parliament. When's Parliament going to meet? I don't know. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the situation. Once the country waited 5 months for a minority Prime Minister, Sir Joe Clark, a wonderful Canadian. I'm not here to malign him. This is the simplest thing. I've written the reform into my book. It just requires an act of Parliament. There are models, New Zealand and Australia. They have an 8-week rule, or one has a 1-month rule, the other an 8-week rule.
As you know, the members of this committee are pretty keen on meeting. We're meeting even in the summer.
Okay, well, really, Mr. Chair, it would be just terrible if you get a new electoral system, you have a proportional representation producing a true representation of the Canadian people. You elect the Parliament, and when will it meet?
Well, I think you're right. I think you're right, Professor, in the sense that I think, Professor, you're right in the sense that any change in the system would have to bring along with it many changes to the rules of the House.
I'm sorry to overstep my time.
No, but it was fascinating what you had to say. But we will get to a round of questions.
Okay.
We will get to a round of questions, and there'll be many questions for you, I know for sure. Professeur Dutil.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Professor Dutil. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I'm honored and delighted to be invited to address this august committee and to discuss the merits and demerits of electoral reform. Your work is very important. It's extremely valuable. It comes at a good time in our history. You're going to find that I'm quite at odds with my younger colleague. Where he sees vices, I see virtues. I want to say from the outset that I'm not against electoral reform. I had the opportunity of speaking to a committee of the Ontario Legislature in May, where I argued that the province's municipal election laws should be amended to allow parties to be funded and to operate freely within the parameters of provincial electoral laws. Sometimes electoral reform is necessary in order to create a legislative assembly or a city council that will offer better government and better governance. However, I am against reforms that are poorly thought out, ideas borrowed from completely different jurisdictions that will bring Canadians to the edge of the precipice. Advocates of electoral reform urge Canadians not to look down, to take a leap. I'm positively shocked sometimes at how their predictions and conjectures about the consequences of the changes of our electoral system are vague. They have clearly forgotten the old dictum that doctors learn from their earliest studies: first, do no harm. Electing members of Parliament is not just a question of getting the right kind of demographic representation or a perfect match of votes to results. The purpose of elections is also to give Parliament a good chance of supporting an effective, functioning cabinet that can get on with the work of managing a government, an effective one that can capture perhaps not all the votes or even a majority of the votes, but will capture the zeitgeist of the times and respond to it. There are two tests for elections, and they are not divorced from one another. Avant d'aller plus loin, Monsieur le Président, permettez-moi de vous offrir mes réponses.
So before going on, Chair, let me please answer the questions that have been asked. I've seen no proof that any other method of election would be better than the current system to meet these two requirements. This system will celebrate its 225th birthday next year. It has survived the epochs. It has shown that it is flexible. It welcomes new ideas and new dynamic movements. It has transmitted the zeitgeist of generations of Canadians to Parliament. It has allowed for an alternance of power and a regular renewal of MPs in the House of Commons. It is stable and it's accepted by the vast majority of Canadians.
A good job, collectively, in keeping this country together. Collectively, over time, they have delivered good, stable government that was broadly representative of the people. Why get rid of something that has worked well in favor of a complicated system few understand, or of a system that would reward small regional or sectorial interests by giving them the balance of power or the opportunity to hold governments hostage at any given turn? This country is hard enough to govern as it is. Our national parties have been the crossroads of ideas in our country, and the system that has allowed them to flourish should be allowed to continue. Je ne suis pas en faveur du vote obligatoire. Je pense qu'il est faux.
I'm not in favor of mandatory voting. I think that it's false to force somebody who has not studied the issues or who doesn't sufficiently care about the issues to go and vote. Why? Why force people to do something that they don't want to do? It's not a good habit to take in a liberal society.
Who earn less, who are less educated in terms of schooling and in terms of democracy. A Statistics Canada study in 2011 asked people why they do not vote. We can talk about the solutions, but let me give you some of the figures. 1.3% of respondents said it was because of religious beliefs. 3.7% said because they were not on the voters list. That can be fixed. 3.8% said they forgot to vote. That could be fixed a little bit too. 7.6% said they didn't like the issues or the candidates. That's your fault. 8.5% said they were ill or disabled. That's something that maybe can be fixed. Elections Canada's done a good job. 10% said they were out of town or away. That can be fixed. 11.4% said other. And maybe among those people, they did not think that their vote counted. 11% out of 40% gives you about 40% of the 4% of the population. 22.9% said they were too busy, and 28% said they were not interested. You have a real problem here that I think can be addressed with good programs, and many programs already exist. It's just a matter of doing a better job. Again, that's a 2011 survey. Changing the electoral system will not change these attitudes. I do support continued, and the third point, I do support continued research on online voting and to its eventual adoption once we are all assured that it is accurate and foolproof. Je veux que le système parlementaire
I want to see the parliamentary system work better. And let me make that clear. I want it to be more representative and more legitimate. But it is incumbent on parliamentarians to ensure that this becomes a reality and that they work within an electoral system which has delivered stable government and government that has remained sensitive to the problems of the population. The parties should choose more women and more minority candidates. We don't need to change the system, however, for that to happen.
You to consider the Senate. Remember, it was created to balance out the electoral distortions of the House of Commons. Mostly, we've allowed our governments to make a hash of this noble institution. I don't want it to be elected. I don't want it to be equal. It has all the attributes to be effective, however, without frustrating the will of the duly elected members of the House of Commons. Imagine an upper house that contains representatives of segments in our society that don't make it to the House of Commons. They should be members of the Green Party and the NDP in the Senate, recognized as such. I'm delighted that this Parliament has a record number of people from the First Nations. There are many other minorities, however, that are represented now in the House of Commons. But there are so many who have no representation in Ottawa, and yet the lever is right there. It could be pulled with the next vacancy. The age of retirement guarantees turnover. I urge you to consider this idea. Again, the problem is politics, not the system. All it takes is goodwill and enlightened politics, and there's no need to change the system. Now, you've been asked to examine the issue of engagement. There is no evidence that alternative systems favor participation more than others, except in two factors. The first one is mandatory voting. The 7 jurisdictions that have adopted it typically boast a participation rate in the high 80s. If you want that, consider forced voting. The second one is one you never hear about, voting on Sunday, which is a typical practice in Europe. Give people a day off to vote. Vote on a Sunday when most people are not at work, dealing with kids, dealing with school, taking them to lessons, all the things that a normal family does during the day, during the week. Give them a chance to go vote. Of course, advanced polls are to be encouraged and continue to be encouraged. I'm on public record already on this issue regarding the idea that the whole, any proposal coming out of the government should be put to a referendum. I want to address that issue of the referendum. I made the argument in the Toronto Star 2 days after the throne speech was read, and last month I published a study on electoral reform, on the precedents of electoral reform in this country, and it was published by the Fraser Institute. My point was that there's a very rich history of electoral reform in this country that has established a series of precedents. My argument is that the same principle has to be followed for any electoral reform this government proposes. In 1981, the Supreme Court of Canada was faced with a particular problem. The federal government wanted to make massive changes to the Constitution, but there was no clear recipe on how to do it. The issue was referred to the Supreme Court, and it affirmed the existence of constitutional conventions in Canada. A majority of the justices found that the Government of Canada's plan did in fact violate those conventions by trying to act unilaterally. The key point from the Supreme Court of Canada's statement was that precedents and conventions mattered. They are important because they capture a certain idea of political culture and practice. In the context of the British system, one which works without constitutional text and is therefore instructed only by past actions, the British expert Sir Ivor Jennings argued that constitutional conventions, and I quote, provide the flesh that clothes the dry bones of the law. They make the legal constitution work. They keep it in touch with the growth of ideas. Jennings articulated a set of questions to test the validity of convention. For him, 3 conditions had to be met in order to do so, and together they became known as the Jennings test. What were those 3 questions? Question number 1, were there precedents? Question number 2, did the actors in the precedents believe that they were bound by a rule? And question number 3, would there be a constitutional reason for the rule? The Supreme Court applied the Jennings test, and it judged that there did exist a convention by which Ottawa, the provinces, and even the British Parliament had lived up to in order to change the Constitution in the past. the court concluded that the government needed a substantial measure, quote unquote, of provincial consent. The rest is history. I put it to you that the Jennings test applies to this situation. The voting system in practice in Canada is not enshrined in the Constitution. The Constitution Act does specify that members of Parliament must be elected, quote unquote, but says nothing about what system is to be used to choose winners. There is, moreover, no constitutional amending formula that applies to any changes in the way Canadians vote. However, there are precedents and conventions about how elections are determined, and they've been part of the Canadian culture, political culture, for centuries. The Jennings test for conventions thus applies. First, on the issue of precedents. Over the past decades, 4 provincial governments, PEI, Ontario, New Brunswick, and British Columbia, committed to put the question to the people. In New Brunswick in 2006, the PC government, led by Premier Lord, promised a plebiscite also on electoral reform, but that was never held because the government was defeated. And there will be a second referendum, again on electoral reform, in Prince Edward Island this fall. On the issue of number 2, all the key actors believed that they were bound by a rule. In Ontario, Premier Dalton McGuinty declared in 2004, and I quote, "We're going to the citizens of Ontario. We believe the issue of electoral reform is so fundamental, so basic, that we're asking the people of Ontario for their judgment in this matter." Kuldeep Kular, the parliamentary assistant to the Attorney General, declared that, quote, "Ontario's electoral system belongs to Ontarians, not to elected officials or appointed commissions. So we are asking Ontarians to decide for themselves how our political system should work and how they want to elect MPPs here to Queen's Park." In British Columbia, Premier Campbell even established a minimum level of support for the plebiscite. It was applied elsewhere to be accepted. For reform to be enacted, at least 60% of the valid votes had to be cast in support of any proposal, and a simple majority in favor in at least 60% of all electoral districts had to be achieved. Many people argued that the threshold was too demanding. Premier Campbell defended the decision with these words, and I quote, "We believe this is a fundamental and significant change, and we therefore have placed a double approval process in place. There are some who have already suggested that this is too high an approval rating. Clearly, the government disagrees with that. We believe that this is a significant change. It is a significant change that should require the kind of approval that says, indeed, a great majority of people in this province feel that they will benefit from this change." The idea that public approval, and public approval with a supermajority, has been adopted by all other jurisdictions because it is that important. PEI's House Speaker, Gregory Dagan, put it most eloquently. "It stands to reason," he said, "that islanders should have a strong voice in determining how these electoral systems work because they do have a significant bearing on the elections, on the results of an election." Other Westminster jurisdictions over the past 25 years have also gone to the people. Australia, which has long made important changes to electoral systems without consulting the public, changed in 1992 when the Australian Capital Territory put the question to its people. It's a small jurisdiction of about 300,000 people. The 1992 referendum in the ACT, the Australian Capital Territory, was an advisory poll that was held simultaneously with the election. This question simply asked if voters preferred the traditional first-past-the-post system or the single voter transferable system. The members of the ACT, the citizens of the ACT, voted in favor of that. New Zealand went to the people 3 times, first in 1992, and then in 1993, and in 2011. In all 3 cases, the Premier said, and I'm quoting the Premier of 2008, Mr. John Key, he says, we'll, quote, "we'll open our ears to New Zealanders' views on their voting system." Now, it's passed in New Zealand. They adopted change. Following the 2010 general election in the United Kingdom, the Conservative Party, led by David Cameron, and the Liberal Democratic Party, led by Nick Clegg, agreed on a coalition government which committed the government to holding a referendum. Prime Minister Cameron emphasized the need for a clear public mandate. In January 2011, the Prime Minister said that a referendum was necessary, quote, "in order to allow the people to decide on voting reform, and that a referendum was a democratic step." A month later, the Prime Minister declared that, quote, "far above our belief about how the voting should work, we share a much more important belief, a belief in democracy and the voice of the people being heard." It's clear that the other Westminster systems have also considered electoral change. What is remarkable is that in the last 25 years, governments felt compelled to allow the voters to have a say. The Canadian practice at the provincial level was thus consistent with other systems that have operated under the principles of the United Kingdom, as we say in our Constitution. The Jennings test on validity of the conventional rule can thus be applied to the necessity of seeking popular agreement on electoral reform. To the Jennings question of what are the precedents, the record is clear. To the question of did the leaders understand that they were under a rule, the record is also clear. Les gouvernements se sont sentis contraints par l'idée.
Governments have felt constrained by the idea that no change to the election system can be undertaken without the explicit consent of the majority and sometimes a supermajority of the electorate. The national governments of the UK and New Zealand have done that. The governments of major Canadian provinces like Ontario and BC have done it, as have smaller provinces like New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island. Governments dominated by progressive conservatives have felt the need to consult with voters, as have done Liberal and Labour governments. Referendums have been used by governments in minority situations or in coalitions, as well as by dominant majority governments. The instrument of a referendum has been the conventional instrument for consulting with voters on changes in the way that their representatives are elected.
Encore 5 minutes, Monsieur le Président.
Still have 5 minutes, Mr. Chair. Under 4 minutes. All right, less than 4. I will go to my final point. The way that we vote shapes our political culture. Canada is not perfect and its democracy has some problems, but we also need to recognize that the system has worked and that voters have accepted the system for generations and they must be consulted with any changes. The Government of Canada cannot simply suppose that it can unilaterally change the way that we vote. It has no exclusive claim to the electoral process. It is not their exclusive purview. They need to respect convention.
4 times by Canadians in plebiscites adds all the more urgency and morality to the matter. The past views that voters have expressed cannot be simply discarded. As is the case in any other jurisdiction, the federal government must conduct rigorous and comprehensive consultations that are not simply driven by the self-appointed advocates of reform. Beyond that, the process must include a referendum, no matter how much it costs or how long it delays decisions. Regardless of the result, the government must abide by it. Without going to the people, it can expect no legitimacy to make any changes to the precious process of elections, the very essential tools of our democratic civilization. The way we vote is not a mere trifle, it is structural. So now I'll put my political historian's hat on and tell you more about how this has affected our political culture. There is a danger in wanting to make changes to the structures that correct flaws in our political parties. The Prime Minister indicated that the first past the post is a voting system that generates disparities between votes gained and the number of seats secured. Since 1960, we have had 10 elections that resulted in majority governments, but only one case in 1984 did the winning party receive more than 50% of the vote. They're obviously reading Professor Russell's book. What's wrong with this, I ask? Canadians seem perfectly at ease with the system. What's wrong with giving a group of parliamentarians the right to govern, knowing that most people voted against them? This is where I come to the issue of political culture. The net effect is modesty. Governments know that there are few years or even months away from being turfed from power. It sharpens the mind. It means consultation. It means gradual change. But it does mean change. It means waiting for consensus to take shape in the population. That's political culture at work. The other effect, of course, is that it creates genuine competition among parties to improve their results. Look at the progress this country has made since 1960, most with governments shaped with less than 50% of the vote. We are the envy of the world. People risk their lives to live in a system where a party that receives a minority of votes rules. It's not an accident, and people in government ignore it people in Parliament ignore it at their peril. Canadians favour a political culture that allows for a clear transfer of power from one party to another. We like turnover. It's painful for you, I know. But we want to be able to kick the bums out, quote unquote, when they stop listening. Canadians favour this system. Are there riots in the street when electoral results are delivered? No. Why? Because the system did its job. It elected a representative for the riding, not a representative for a political brand. Our political culture holds you to serve your constituents. There are regulations that govern your constituency offices. You're not allowed to show your colors. I know some of you do, and you're not supposed to. You do it at your own peril. Our political culture is not harsh. We don't expect the parties to deliver on all their commitments, only the important ones. A system that creates modesty, a system that does lead to arrogance. But the arrogant have discovered that they don't stay in power very long because our system allows people to remove governments. In conclusion, Mr. President, my advice is fourfold. Remember, first, that the key purpose of elections is to allow Parliament to form effective and efficient government. Examinez de près la question.
Look closely at the question of voting on a Sunday or a holiday. Third, use your situation to ask Canadians if they think that votes should be mandatory.
Agitate to make the Senate more representative starting now. Merci de m'avoir accordé cette occasion de vous adresser la parole, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak. Thank you for your consideration. Thank you very much. Thank you to both our witnesses for your passionate presentations in favor of your respective points of view. I think that we are heading towards a very, very stimulating discussion, and that's what we're looking for. So we will now follow the tradition that we have established within our committee, which means that we will proceed with 2 rounds of questions where each member will have 5 minutes for questions and answers within the 5 minutes. So we will start with Mr. Aldag.
I'm going to start by just noting that many of us are following feedback from Twitter. And one of the early pieces I just wanted to pass on, Jennifer Ross wanted to thank Professor Russell for posting his brief on the website so that others would be able to follow along. So just wanted to pass along that thank you, as well as I appreciated your light way of presenting very excellent content, and I really thank you for that. The first question, I'm going to go to Professor Duthill. You've made your comments, your thoughts on referendum very clear, and I appreciate that. In an article, it was the Toronto Star, December 9th article. It was something that pops up when I Googled your name, and you made a comment in that article in which you talked about this idea of electoral reform, and you noted that our government must conduct true consultations, rigorous and comprehensive consultations that are not simply driven by the self-appointed advocates of reform. And I'd like to know, our government hasn't made a clear decision yet on whether or not a referendum will happen. We're in the information gathering stage now. We're looking at benefits, pros and cons of that. I'd like your thoughts on what those other true consultations from your perspective would look like. What else can we do to make sure that we're gathering a range of perspectives and true input from Canadians on this very important issue?
Well, I mean, thank you for your question. I wrote this in December, and I think that what has happened, what has transpired, is very good. I like the composition of this committee. I think that you've set very high objectives. You got a good budget to get the job done. My only worry is that the kind of people who come up to these meetings are likely to be convinced that electoral reform is necessary. People who don't think it's necessary are not likely to take the trouble to defend what they think is obvious. So that's what I'm saying. I mean, you've got to make an effort, and it's not easy, and I appreciate all the efforts being made, but you got to seek out as many voices as possible, not just the people who are in favor of electoral reform. Let's be blunt. The people who are in favor of massive electoral reform, of proportional representation or other systems have been at this for a generation now, 25 years. The people who want to support the system are, call them what they are, the silent majority, the people who think the system is actually functioning quite well, that the system really doesn't need very much reform. I think that if you can come up with practical ideas, ideas that are realizable, that are possible, that can be done, you might actually come out of this exercise with something genuinely good. The issue of mandatory voting, for example. I mean, use the opportunity to ask people, do you think this is a good idea? I've told you I'm not in favor. I don't think it's consistent with our values. But maybe Canadians are. And there's a reason, there's a good reason, by the way, why you might want to consider that. The experience of Western democracies is that mandatory voting will boost your participation rate by about 8 to 10%. I mean, Canada has an average of about 70% participation rate, going back to 1867. That's not bad. It's not great, but it's not bad. You want to put mandatory voting on that? Well, you can put an extra 8 to 10%. That would bring you up to 80%. And then if you want to vote on Sunday, there are studies that show that Sunday provides you another premium of about 6 or 7%. Sunday mostly, also Saturday. The third most popular day is Monday. When do we vote? Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday? Try Sunday voting. Ask people, is my point. Ask people, would you mind voting on a Sunday? It used to be an idea that was received with a great deal of hostility. I think times have changed. And again, with the combination of mandatory voting and Sunday voting, you might be looking at a premium of 10, 15%. Who knows? Who knows? All sorts of people have different reasons not to vote. And there are all sorts of variations on that. But anyway, I think that good practical ideas can actually lead this committee to deliver something that's tangible and applicable quickly.
Okay, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Reid.
Thank you. Thanks to both of our witnesses. I've read with great interest Professor Dutille's paper, The Imperative of a Referendum, and also some years ago I read with great interest Professor Russell's book, Two Cheers for Minority Government. In fact, Professor Russell, you came and spoke to this book to a committee that I sat on a few years ago. I'm sure you don't remember me, but your presentation was very memorable, so I remember you. I did want to start by going to Professor Dutille, and I had two questions for you. The first one is, you said, and I quote, in your presentation today, no matter the results of a referendum, the government must abide by them. That's your exact words. So I just want to be clear that when you say this, you do not mean that if there is a referendum and it rejects a new proposal, that ends the discussion, or alternatively, that if a new method is adopted, approved by the people, that eliminates the possibility of further reforms. That is to say that I assume you are not saying that the second referendum in British Columbia, the proposed second referendum in PEI, or the 2011 referendum in New Zealand, which are different versions of looking at the same question again, you're not saying that is illegitimate.
I could add a lot more subclauses to what I wrote. I mean, I would assume that the question will be clear, that I would favor a supermajority on these issues, quite frankly, as the provincial governments did in Canada, as they did in Australia and New Zealand, because these matters are very important. It can't just be decided by 50% plus one. I think, if you meet all those conditions, if you have a fair vote, yeah, I think governments have to abide by them. I mean, I'm a Democrat. I think governments should have to abide by them. Am I understanding your question?
Yes, abide by the decision to either implement or not implement a system. Yes. I'm just saying that revisiting the question at a future date is not something you're actually precluding as a possibility. Or am I wrong?
Well, no. I mean, I would not want our system to be making a habit of turning to the people every few years and ask them if they're happy with the electoral system. No, I think that maybe once a generation, maybe once every 2 generations, maybe once a century might be a good idea. Who knows what our democracy is going to look like with electronic voting in 15, 20 years' time. So, I mean, I really can't speculate into the future. I wish I could.
Let me ask you a different question regarding the Jennings test. My own teacher regarding constitutional conventions is the writings of Albert Van Dicey, a generation or 2 before Sir Ivor Jennings, and I haven't read Jennings, so let me just ask this question. He lays out his 3 rules, one of which is, did the key actors in the precedents feel they were bound by a rule? This appears to assume that conventions grow over time, that they can't be eroded. So I have to ask the question, we today face a prime minister who says, I reject a convention that other provincial actors in Canada and other actors across the Commonwealth have accepted exist. I say that whatever they felt bound them, I am not bound to go to the people. I have my mandate from the 2015 election. I will proceed forward without a referendum. And he then goes on to criticize referenda in various ways. But let me ask the question, how does all this work when you are faced with an actor who takes that point of view towards what appeared to have been an established convention?
The Jennings test, I raised the Jennings test because, again, it was specifically applied by the Supreme Court of Canada in 1981. It's not something I just pulled out of a hat. the Supreme Court applied the Jennings test, and I think that the Jennings test applies itself again in the situation where you are trying to change a fundamental aspect of our Constitution, an unwritten Constitution, but we've been voting the first past the post system since 1792. That predates everything. 1792, the first election in Lower Canada. We've been using this kind of system. So you're touching on a pillar of our system, and we don't have a constitutional amendment formula for pillars of our system. So I think at a situation like that, you have to identify whether this is in fact a convention. The Jennings test gives you a test to determine whether it's a convention. I think it meets that convention test, but it's not going to be my decision. I suspect that what should happen is that either you or the government refers it to the Supreme Court and let the Supreme Court decide, does this Jennings test apply in this case? And we're all going to have to live by that kind of decision.
Merci. Alors, c'est au tour de Monsieur Cullen.
Thank you. It's Mr. Cullen's turn.
Mr. Dutil, are you making the contestation that minority parliaments are not effective?
Oh, no, I would never say that.
Oh, no. But you raised the four horsemen of the apocalypse. If we go to a minority situation out of some sort of proportional representation, you described people willing to die for the right to have minority parliaments and
false majorities. False
majorities,
yes.
As Professor Russell. Yet minority parliaments, which are a likely outcome of proportional type systems, would you agree?
Yeah, I just don't like proportional systems.
Yeah,
I'm afraid that proportional systems...
Allow me this. So that out of proportional systems, if the committee were to adopt a recommendation for Canada to have a proportional system, that one of the outcomes, because I like this conversation, we're talking about outcomes to the voters, yes, to the policies that may come out of a parliament. You liked this committee.
I like this committee a lot.
It's interesting because this committee is made up of the voice of Canadians in the last election, mostly. That the representation that you see here is the outcome of how Canadians voted in the last election. Why we wouldn't want that to manifest onto a parliament writ large is an interesting question, but minority parliaments have been far more productive over time in terms of what Canadians want and cherish. Let me run through a quick list that I'm sure you're familiar with. Public pensions, employment insurance, the flag, the Accountability Act, post-secondary funding, bilingualism, and healthcare. All things that I think Canadians cherish quite a bit, all the result of minority parliaments, which again would be likely, much more likely, out of systems that are called proportional. So why not? Why be so opposed to an electoral system that would produce more often governments that have, in our history, Canadian history, produced better results for Canadians?
And the answer is simple. These were minority governments that were formed out of national parties,
right? Not
out of small sectoral parties, regional parties that can somehow put together a coalition and each divide up the spoils in terms of what they want out of government policy. We have in those minority governments.
Hold on. Allow me this. We just saw in the last British election a regional party, the SNP, take virtually every seat out of Scotland. We've had the experience in this country where the Bloc Québécois have formed the official opposition. We've had this under first past the post. We all recognize, I think, and all of our witnesses have, there's no perfect system out there. It's about what you prioritize and what you think are more valuable. We think that systems that reflect the will of the voter, as this committee does from the last election, are inherently driven towards more cooperation. And we've had testimony from other witnesses, esteemed witnesses in countries that have operated under these, that regionalism that you talk about is actually the opposite result of more proportional systems. I want to turn to Mr. Russell, Dr. Russell, for a second. It was suggested earlier that all we need is goodwill and enlightened politics. Oh, we wish for such things all the time. The effectiveness of connecting voters geographically so that there's local representation, you know who your representatives are, along with fairness, what's called fairness in the voting system. You talked about making Parliament more relevant in people's lives, giving it more connection. Can you elaborate on that under the proportional systems that you've advocated?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that. And I'm coming, just my own little odyssey. I was pretty stuck on mixed member proportion. I think this committee's getting to know all this technical talk, where you have lists to top up first past the post. But the more I read and the more I look at other countries in the world, I'm becoming pretty interested in the multi-member constituency, the STV model. And I noticed some of the more creative Canadian political scientists, you're going to hear from them, are coming up with more STV models, in which you have you have larger districts, larger constituencies, but maybe as many as 5 members, but you retain that geographic connection. And you haven't heard yet from Jean-Pierre Kingsley.
We have.
Yeah? You've seen his? Well, I'm not up to date in what you heard. See, he kind of combines it, which is a very interesting idea. Having single-member constituencies in more rural parts of Canada and multi-member constituencies in the cities.
So, again, back to the second piece of my question, which was...
We're out of time.
Oh, I'll ask it in another round, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful.
Monsieur Thériault.
Bonjour, messieurs.
Good afternoon, sir. I would like to take advantage of your contradictory nature to ask you 2 brief questions. How would you explain the emergence of cynicism among voters with regards to politics, and what do you think of the unwritten law about party lines?
I'm afraid I didn't catch the question. Could you help me with it?
Yes. How would you explain the emergence of cynicism of the public with regards to politics, and what do you think of the unwritten rule of the party line?
There's a lot of it, but I don't have any data. My guess is that we're less cynical, citizenry in Canada, less cynical about democracy than most other countries. But I don't see excessive cynicism out there. Do you, sir? Do you think a lot of people are cynical? Maybe I mix with a very optimistic group of people.
We don't have any data on cynicism. We have to take that into account. I'm a historian by training, so I have a tendency to look at things through the perspective of time. When I read what politicians have lived through, I don't have the impression that we are more cynical than we were before. There are eras where prime ministers were defeated in their own ridings, and it's been a long time since that happened. That happened sometimes at the provincial level, recently in Quebec. I don't believe that there is any particular degree of cynicism that has become part of the system. I would recognize that since the 80s, there's been diminishing participation of Canadians, but I would remind you that that is a trend that affects everybody in the Western world. The statistics are very clear. Everybody in the Western world, whether it be France, Canada, Belgium, the United States, or other countries, all are on a downward trend since the 80s, and it's going back up. I think what Professor Russell means to say is that perhaps we are climbing that trend again, and that's it. The cynicism is just an impression. So contrary to what some people attempt to put forward, there's no causal link between the electoral system, the mechanics of it, and how that can lead to countering a rise in cynicism, because some people insist that changing the voting system would have a consequence on the trust and level of cynicism of the public with regards to politics. Now, when it comes to party lines, you propose 2 types of voting. What do you think of the party line?
Part of my presentation mentioned the danger in a minority parliament with no majority party, of a very strict discipline coming into play, because every vote the government stands or falls, and it's do or die, right? And my suggestion is, if we had a system that more accurately represented the people of Canada, that would, I think, go away, because you wouldn't have one confidence vote after another. Parties would be less inclined to move them. The party leaders on the government side would be more inclined to make more issues-free votes. And I think the constructive vote of non-confidence, which has come into play in some of the European parliamentary democracies, is well worth looking at, to again make for a parliament that doesn't just reel from crisis to crisis. That you don't want. That you do not want. But we know from comparative study, and I hope you're talking to political scientists who know about these other countries, that they don't reel from crisis to crisis in the countries that have a proportional system.
Madam, we'll have to go to Ms. May.
Thank you. And I have to say it's an enormous honor to be in the position of being a member of Parliament at this table and putting questions to one of my heroes in academia, but of political science, in you, Dr. Russell. It's extraordinary, and I'm grateful to you for being here in person and answering questions. And I also think that it's wonderful to have someone who, no offense, but you're sort of an eminence grise in the field. And there's no grise about you at all. You've made us laugh, you've entertained us, but you've made it really clear what you think. In the written submission, you touched on something that you didn't mention verbally, and yeah. I find it intriguing. And it's the risk, to put it to you, I take it that there's an additional risk in what you term a false majority, when, as you point out in your paper, Canada, quote, has the world's most centralized parliamentary democracy, going on to say it's likely that in a minority parliament there is likely to be a diminution of its officials' capacity to interfere with parliamentary activities, by which I suspect you mean the executive, the Prime Minister's office. I wonder if you want to comment on whether there's a benefit in constraining excesses of power.
Well, we developed really from Pierre Trudeau's time, and he really began the process of a very large and very powerful Prime Minister's office. Most Canadians are unaware that it's much bigger and more powerful than in London, England, than in Canberra, than in Wellington, or other Westminster democracies. And it became, I think, the elephant in our democratic room when unelected people, whose main purpose is the re-election of the government, have so much power over policy and even begin to interfere with cabinet government and parliamentary government, telling cabinet ministers what they can and when they can speak, helping, that's a nice word for it, MPs in question time give the right answers. And an international study of the centralization of power in parliamentary democracies, done 10 years ago, and it's quoted in my book, very carefully done, about the centralization of power again in parliamentary democracies. Canada was much the most centralized, and I should add, all that research was done before 2006. I mention that because someday that was just a characteristic of Mr. Harper's way of governing. But no, it had come in under Liberals and it had been carried on by Conservatives and intensified. And Canadians, I say to my friend Patrice, they don't go out in the streets and say, damn it, let's throw stones. We got unelected people telling cabinet ministers and MPs what to do. We are a quiet people. We put up with awful situations. But I just give you one example of, it almost made me weep. The book on Tragedy in the Commons, interviews with members of Parliament of all parties and their experience over 10 years. Not quite the last 10 years, but 10 years in this century. And they were miserable years. Now, I say to Patrice, oh, sure, we can live with that. We can still be a great country. We are a terrific country. But I just think democratically, we can do better. We can do a lot better, and we should try to do better.
Thank you, Professor Russell. I want to also ask you, you haven't touched on this question, which is, I think is, I'm hesitant to even ask you because I think it's not really something we should waste our time talking about a great deal. But since referendum keeps coming up, I wonder if you have a view on whether there's a constitutional requirement that we hold a referendum.
Well, the one thing about constitutional conventions, I've written a lot about them, spent a good deal of my life with them, and I certainly like the Jennings test, but as Sir Ivor Jennings be the first to acknowledge, they're really identified in the political process. And I'm sorry, sir, I'm forgetting your name. If a prime minister no longer says, I'm not doing that anymore, unlike a legal rule in a statute or in the Constitution itself, that's the end of the convention. In other words, conventions live or die in the political arena. My own sense of where we are with this question of should we have a referendum if this committee brings forward a recommendation. I think it has to be a recommendation with a fair consensus behind it. I think the answer is yes. I don't think for any sophisticated constitutional reason, but I'll predict that if you didn't do that, the whole issue will be not having a referendum. The issue won't be the merits of your recommendation. The issue will be Patrice's point. You're not doing it democratically enough.
Thank you. We'll go to Ms. Romanato now.
Donc, merci beaucoup, Professor.
Thank you very much, Professor Dutil and Professor Russell, for your presence here today, as well as for your highly interesting testimony.
I'd like to have some direct and frank conversations. My question is for Professor Russell. With your suggestion of proportional representation, would you suggest that minority governments would be formed, or would a new precedence of coalition governments be expected?
Well, I think coalition has become, I use this phrase, I know you, a bad brand. Mm-hmm. It got branded bad in 2008 by leaders of the Conservative Party. And I thought that was very misleading. I've already said I prefer a minority government arrangement to coalition, but it's not bad. But the one thing to be sure about, even though there was a lot of criticism of the Liberal NDP proposed coalition, there was not a convention established that to have a coalition, you have to announce it before the election. That was the argument that some of the Conservative leaders said. If you're going to have a coalition, you've got to say beforehand to the people, we're going to have a coalition, and then you can have one. I don't know any country, I don't know a single country that has such a rule. Certainly we never have had. So you're free to have a coalition, even though you didn't advertise it during the election. I like the play in Parliament in minority government situations a little better than coalitions. New Zealand has a very interesting combination of both. It usually has minority coalitions, and the Green Party, for instance, usually stays out. And because the minority coalition is a minority, there's a lot of interplay between the Greens and some other. There's now a separate Maori party besides Maori seats, and there's a lot of interplay even between that coalition and minority. I like to see give and take in Parliament, and so that the outcome of parliamentary debates is not preordained. Everybody knows, oh yeah, they could talk all night, but this is going to be the policy. I think a real parliament, to be deliberative, means they're really going to deliberate. I'll give you one. I remember in what I called the sort of almost textbook example of Harper's first minority government, a good textbook example. On a couple of examples, foreign policy. We're divided about Afghanistan. Had a terrific parliamentary debate. It split the Liberals, but it created a modified conservative policy. Then I think on the budget, the NDP negotiated some changes in child welfare policy with a conservative government and got, for at least a while, a better policy out. And it was the give and take in the House. And I like to see that happening in the House of Commons.
Okay. Do I have some more time? Okay. So one area that is really important to me in my background is youth engagement. And yet we did see an increase in youth participation in the last federal election. I'd like your recommendations on how we can maintain that engagement, both in terms of voter participation, but also in engaging that next generation of folks who want to run, which I'm concerned that we're not doing enough. So I'd like your suggestions on how we can increase not only youth voter participation, but their willingness, their interest in actually running for office.
Yeah, well, that's a really important question, and we're getting to know a lot more about youth and politics. I mean, we know the bad news that the youngest cohort of voters, 18 to 25, have the lowest turnout. But we have some very resourceful colleagues, Paul Howe at New Brunswick and Howard Mell at University of Montreal, who have been looking worldwide, and particularly in Western Europe, about the same phenomenon. And I suppose what they're really coming up with is improving how schools handle the teaching of politics. And if you read their books, it isn't just a matter of teaching, it's the type of teaching. It's interactive. It's not just a teacher saying, here's what Parliament does. It's very creative, interactive, having mock parliaments and so on. We don't do enough of that in Canada. We don't have enough push to do it. The Teachers Institute, which some of you know, is part of that. They bring high school students here every November, but only about 110 of them I've helped raise money for, and that's wonderful. But we've got to really help the school teachers.
Thank you.
Something that I found out to my horror is Ontario, my province, is the only province in which a civics course is mandatory in high school.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Mr. Kenney now.
That's not good news.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to both Professors Russell and Dutil for your compelling testimony before us today, and in the case of Professor Russell, a lifetime of work on these and other issues in particular. Just a couple of perhaps editorial notes to which you're free to respond, Professor Russell, but you mentioned the 2008 NDP Liberal coalition. I would submit one of the reasons that polling indicated 70 to 80% of Canadians rejected that proposed coalition is in part because it was not advertised as a possibility prior to the election, and in part because it involved the Bloc Québécois. We recall Mr. Duceppe signing that accord. So just as you have suggested there is a political requirement for a referendum. In order to grant it the process democratic legitimacy, I would submit that parties who prospectively will create a coalition must at least admit the possibility of that, given our longstanding history of not having formal coalitions. But more specific, one other point of sort of information, I gather Israel does have a floor for their PR system at 3.25%, so the most marginal part. That's part of the reforms that Israel made, I think, about 15 years ago. I wonder if you could both comment on the following. Professor Dutil has outlined the Jennings test as it may apply to the question of a constitutional convention for referendum and electoral reform. He has also suggested that perhaps the government may want to refer that the question of whether or not there is a convention to the Supreme Court. Would either of you care to comment on this as it relates to the Supreme Court decision on the Senate reference case 2 years ago, where the Supreme Court seemed to suddenly adopt a very strict originalist jurisprudence with respect to the original intention of the founders vis-a-vis the Canadian Senate? Essentially, to paraphrase, the court said that the founders had a particular idea of what the Senate ought to be, which idea would be violated by elections to the Senate. Do you not think it's also possible that following the same kind of jurisprudential line, the court would say that the founders had a particular idea of what the House of Commons would be based on first past the post?
You have 2.5 minutes to answer Mr. Kenny's question.
I think MMP would run a risk there because it produces two kinds of members of Parliament. And that phrase in the Senate reference about the architecture of the Constitution, you would agree with me, is not a precise phrase. And creating two kinds of members might be found to be a deviation from the architecture. However, having multi-member ridings in the STV system, various versions of the STV system, I think would be okay. We've actually had that in Canadian history. So that's another reason why I've moved from MMP to STV, as I think there's less of a constitutional doubt about STV.
I think, but I mean, the question, depending on what is being proposed, the Senate, the Supreme Court is would have to make a decision and determine whether it applies or not. And I think that it's very hard to predict at this point what they would finally decide. And I find this Supreme Court particularly difficult to decipher anyway. But I think that the Jennings test does compel the government to make its case and to make its case to the people, because we would be moving away from precedents, and we'd be moving away from an established practice in this country that has lasted far longer than this country. So I'm not really sure I've answered your question very well.
So yesterday we had a couple of
about 30 seconds, unfortunately.
We had other political scientists on the panel. When I posed the question, is there not a convention for a referenda on electoral reform, they simply answered no, but they never presented any reasons. What arguments against the convention would exist? Because I haven't heard anybody actually offer any arguments.
There is no argument against the conventions. I mean, when the Supreme Court of Canada was asked in 1981, they said these conventions matter, and the government of Canada has to abide by those conventions. The government has to work to build substantial agreement among the provinces. The government, therefore, had to abide by that rule. It's not something you can simply dismiss. Conventions matter a great deal. Let me quote Peter Hogg, the authoritative. Est-ce que je peux? Non?
Pas vraiment.
Okay,
May I? Not really.
I'll give up my next...
Okay, go ahead, but we are going over 5 minutes for each one. Yeah. Okay, sure. Okay. Go ahead.
Peter Hogg said in his Constitutional Law of Canada, and I quote, "There is a stronger moral obligation to follow a convention than a usage, and that departure from convention may be criticized more severely than departure from usage. Convention matters."
Okay, thanks. Mr. DeCourcy.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et merci
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to each of our speakers this afternoon.
For Professor Russell, in the very first sentence of your brief, you talked about the goal or the value or the result of any change to the electoral system producing a House of Commons that represents the political preferences of the people. I wonder what weight or value you think voters place their political preference around electing someone from a local constituency, someone who they would have a link to, maintaining the value of local representation in any form of electoral system.
Well, we have quite a bit of data on that, not from me or I don't do that kind of research, but those who do what we call psephology, which is the study of voters and why they vote one way or the other. My colleagues who do that in Canada for some time have shown that a party for most people is more important than the individual candidate in their riding. That's a broad, and that hasn't changed for a very long time. Often an outstanding candidate or a really lousy candidate can make a big difference and blow an election or win it. But the majority of Canadians are thinking in party terms when they walk into the booth. And part of that is also the media campaign. The majority of citizens, for maybe unfortunate reasons, don't go to all candidates' meetings. I'm crazy about all candidates' meetings. I think they're like the little town halls, and they're exciting. I always see the same people from my neighborhood there. Most people's experience in election campaign is on television and now the internet, not even reading the papers. And they don't talk about the local candidates. They even don't talk about people who might be in the cabinet very much. They talk about party leaders and the party. And that's the conversation. I knocked on doors in the last election, and I didn't hear much about candidates. I just heard about Mr. Harper, Mr. Trudeau, Liberals and Conservatives. I tried to say a little bit about the Green Party, but they weren't very interested. So there you go.
I guess I asked because we had presentations yesterday from professors citing citizens' assemblies and law commission work and others who cited the values expressed by citizens in those processes around fair representation, around more choice and more preference in balloting, and the need to maintain a link between elector and elected. But I guess I want to follow up on my colleague, Mr. Aldag's question that Professor Dutel was able to answer. But yourself, Professor Russell, do you see any means that we as a committee should consider to ensure that we broadly consult with people in going forward with this committee process?
Oh, boy. You got a tough assignment. And I know there's being talk that you should do a citizens' assembly, and I know that's not going to happen. But on the other hand, they're well written up. And what's really interesting about the BC Citizens' Assembly and the Ontario one, they were really genuine efforts to get a cross-section of people in their respective provinces who had most of them never even thought about electoral reform, to apply their mind to it for a month or so, to have and just to keep on and think about it. And they came out very much for a proportional representation change, STV in BC and MMP in Ontario. And I think so you haven't had one, but to me that's very impressive. I think all you can do, though, when people come before you and proclaim that this or that will happen, I think you should keep them keep asking them for evidence. I think the more evidence-driven you are, the stronger evidence you'll have for a recommendation.
Merci. Merci beaucoup. Alors, on va passer maintenant à M. Blakey.
Thank you very much. We'll now move to Mr. Blakey.
Wanted you to maybe speak a little bit more to the question of, one of the themes of Canadian politics over the last number of decades has been the concentration of power in the PMO, and I think that having a system that produces what you've called false majorities certainly contributes to that. So, what are some of the ways that you see a different electoral system being able to help mitigate that centralization of power in the PMO?
Well, the PMO is not going to shrivel and go away. We have developed, Patrice has used a useful phrase, political culture. We have really, as a country, among all the Westminster parliamentary countries, we've built it into our culture, as we have with political staffers for ministers. I mean, we've changed the political culture of our parliamentary democracy, and a lot of that's been fairly beneficial. I'm particularly supportive of political staffers helping ministers. And I think the PMO has lots of good work to do. But there's a couple of things that we can do. Well, first of all, if the government is in a minority position, I think the tendency to push government members to do what, as they call them, boys, and might I say boys and girls in short pants, are telling them to do, I think some of that will come off. I really do. I'm not naive. There's still going to be a strong PMO. But I found it very distasteful. I watched some Question Time, and I again come back to tragedy in the Commons and what experienced MPs told the Canadian public through that fine book about their subservience to young people who'd never run in politics. They weren't coming directly from the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister's too busy. They'd sort of figured out what they thought would be the right answer at Question Time, or the right thing for a cabinet minister to do if he was going to have a press scrum. So I think there'll be some relaxation of that, but the one legislative change is to overcome a Supreme Court decision. Supreme Court of Canada in 2011, on a quiet June day when everybody was asleep, decided 8 judges to 1. The Prime Minister's office is not an institution of government, and therefore is not under the Access to Information Act. Now, if ever an office was an office of government, it's a PMO. And one judge, LaBelle, a wonderful Quebec judge, wrote a ringing dissent. And we should have, if this is a governmental institution, it should be as open to access to information on such things as budget, the structure, the job descriptions of the people in it, the use of polling, what polling do they do, and what is done with that polling. We're not going to have secret private, I wouldn't call it conversations that must go on between the Prime Minister and his staff, her staff. But we should grow up and acknowledge, as the Supreme Court did not, this is a public institution, and we should know as much about it as any other institution of government. I've written much about that, and I'm afraid the rest of the country, like my having a time when Parliament must meet after an election, those are academic ideas that just go floating away like a leaf on the river. But I hope you heard it.
Okay. I just wanted to ask very quickly, Professor Dutil, you had said that one of the principal, correct me if I misunderstood, but one of the principal goals of an electoral system is to produce a stable government that essentially doesn't have to worry much about being defeated in Parliament. But then what is the kind of effective distinction between the legislative branch and the executive branch of government if the electoral system is really just meant to produce a legislature that is going to be uncritically, often, in the case of false majority, supporting the executive branch?
What I meant was...
Very briefly, please.
What I meant was that what we want is a parliament that will support a government. I mean, where the government is responsible and where it can get the support of a majority in parliament. Whether it comes from one party or a variety of parties doesn't really matter. You want to have a system that is as stable as possible. That's all I'm saying. And we elect people to parliament. In theory, we elect people in parliament so that they get together and form parties, form a unity of opinion that will in turn support an executive. They can come from one party. With time, we've created parties to facilitate that understanding, but they are very separate.
We're going to have to go to Mr. Deltel, please.
Messieurs les professeurs, soyez bienvenus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to our witnesses, welcome to our committee. My colleague noted earlier that what's interesting is to see that we have two eminent academics, two eminent professors with completely different points of view, sitting side by side, head to head, and who are debating the substance of this issue. This is one of the greatest things about our democracy, and we're very lucky to have you here. I believe you're the 7th and 8th professors that we have welcomed to this committee, and that's why I invite everyone to look at the fact that we could also invite another professor who has been quoted as saying that a referendum is essential if we are going to change our voting system. That eminent professor was, of course, the Honourable Stéphane Dion. And I would invite all my colleagues to think about the possibility of inviting and hearing from Mr. Dion. Before going any further, I would like to put into perspective what my NDP colleague, Mr. Collins, said a few moments ago when he said that the committee here represents the will of the population in the last election. I don't agree with that statement from a mathematical point of view, given that the Green Party received 600,000 votes. They have one representative. The NDP has two representatives. Did they get 1.2 million votes? No. They received 3.6 million votes. 6 times more than the Green Party, and in our case, 9 times more. And there are 3 of us, and there's 1 rep from the Green Party. So yes, we have a composition that is different from that of the House of Commons, but it does not at all represent what Canadians said in the recent election. I do have questions to ask you.
So you said earlier that it's very tough time, if we listen to you, that during the last 150 years, and especially in the last 100 years, only 3 times we had a majority government. 2 of them were conservative. Yeah, and 2 of them were conservative too. Diefenbaker and Mulroney, good old days. So, but seriously, Mr. Russell, what I want to say to you is that, sure, it's not clear perfect, it's not crystal perfect, everything. There is no perfect system.
I agree.
But don't you recognize that at least, except in one situation, 1979, the majority of the vote belongs to the government. I mean, except under the Joe Clark's government, 1979, we got less vote than Mr. Trudeau at that time. All the time, in the last 100 years, at least, the majority of the people were in power.
You mean they had a plurality of the vote?
Yeah. I'm talking about the majority.
Well, yes, but that's only a plurality around in the 40%. I just don't think government should be controlled tightly by an administration that only 40% of the people think is what they want.
What was the wrong result of that for the Canadian economy and for the Canadian democracy? What went wrong in the last 100 years with this system?
Well, several things. You'd have to go back to the false majority times. If you take, we just had a false majority before this one, and I think we're seeing that Canadians, for instance, they supported parties that take global warming very seriously, and yet they were under a government that did not seem to do that. And
Sir,
so they were. Okay. I mean, the students that I interact with, I'm still teaching at the University of Toronto. Even my neighbors in Rosedale, they were alarmed that our government was not reflecting their concerns about that issue.
Okay, did you say to your student, okay, sir, we're talking about policies now.
So
it's
I'll
all right.
just give that as one
If you want to
example.
go in that field, I can go in that field too. But it's not the case here. It's not the place for that. What I'm asking you is that, what about what went wrong in this country for the last 100 years because of this political system? You know, what were the decisions was terrific effect in our democracy because of the system that we had in the last 100 years?
I think my colleague would like to answer that.
Well, we have 30 seconds to go through the history.
Je vais vous donner un exemple, Monsieur Deltel, un exemple.
I'll give you an example, just one example, Mr. Deltel, and that was the creation of conscription in 1917 and the distortions that were perpetrated under the election system by the Conservative government in 1917. So I believe in most cases we can justify the policies that were chosen by governments. And obviously, when people have become very angry with the government, I think this is the example that Mr. Russell has just given us, the Conservative government chose to ignore the Canadians' expectations in terms of the environment, and it suffered the consequences to some extent of that. Madame Sahota.
Professor Russell, you were speaking about elections earlier and that we don't vote or place emphasis on the candidate, but rather the party when we are electing our members of parliament. I would agree to that to some extent. I mean, I saw that in my election as well. But I also feel that post-election, the emphasis is different. Post-election, people tend to place a lot of emphasis on their members of parliament, and they want to hold somebody accountable, and they want to go be able to have a connection with somebody, and they want to be able to go see somebody. I mean, it's self-proclaimed, but I think my constituency office is probably one of the busiest constituency offices in the country. And I know that, you know, my constituents think it's very important to be able to reach out to me, and they, you know, definitely point out, we voted for you. We voted for you, not necessarily, you know, the Prime Minister, but for you. So we want you, hold you accountable to hear us out, whether it's on Canada Post or the environment or whatever it may be. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on that? You know, having that local connection to a member of Parliament.
Well, I think it's a very important dimension of parliamentary government, and you people experience it every day, and particularly when you're not in Ottawa. I think the STV system is one of the things I like about it, is it retains that and broadens it. And let me give an example of my own part of Canada, the middle of Toronto. We've hardly ever had, in recent years, a Conservative member of Parliament. My area of downtown Toronto is full of Conservatives. And under an STV system, the Conservatives would have a member of Parliament, I'm just convinced of it, and maybe even two, and not always a Liberal or an NDP. I could reverse that in other parts of the country, in Redmonton, as I love to call it, where for a long time, it's a little bit easier now for a Liberal to get elected, not very easy. They have there's a lot of Liberals in Edmonton, and they have not had a member of Parliament. I think also of Aboriginal people who rarely have the numbers in any given riding, but under a single riding of the size of our ridings now. But under an STV system, it's likely that there could be scope and opportunity for an Aboriginal candidate, much more than under our one-member simple plurality system. So I think we will even be strengthening the ties between elections, between the Member of Parliament and the House and the people.
But what system do you think allows for the most accountability for members of parliament, to be able to hold them accountable, not for one member, like in a district where you would have 5 or so members that you were speaking of earlier. How do you, what if one member, shrugs some of their responsibilities and the other, how do you hold them all accountable?
If I understand your question, I'll use a technical word. I'm a Burkean when it comes to the role of the MP. I don't see the MP as simply a representative of the people in his or her riding. You elect a member of parliament, you elect because you think that person has good judgment on the issues of the day. The people in any constituency, any of them in Canada, are divided. They don't have a single view. And I don't believe in the accountability of the member of parliament to the electorate in his or her riding. I think it's important to spend lots of time in the riding and meet the people. And again, with STV, there's likely to be not just one flavor of political MP in the area, but several. But I don't believe in accountability of the member of parliament to the people in the riding. I'll say that publicly. At election time, of course, if you've done a lousy job, they may throw you out to the extent that that's an issue in the election.
Okay, thank you. We'll start the second round now with Mr. Aldag for 5 minutes.
Great, thank you. Professor Russell, I'm going to start. One of the things that I've heard from previous witnesses is that we're going to need to narrow things down at some point. We're going to need, don't consult on 18 different models, choose 3 or 4. And so as I try to understand what those 3 or 4 best models might be best suited to our system, I'm looking for whatever wisdom I can get. And so in your submission, you had indicated looking at MMP or an STV system with a preference for STV. And if I understood your comments in your first or in your opening comments, you made some sort of reference to possible constitutional issue. And I don't know if I misunderstood that or if there's something there related to MMP. And so, and if there is something, there's a Twitter question I'll get to, but first of all, I just want to know if you want to expand on why you're saying STV is perhaps best suited to Canada, given our unique, whatever those values and attributes are. So if you could take a minute on that.
Well, STV retains the one kind of member of parliament. It means at the local level, there's multi-party MPs to represent the distribution of political preferences in the neighborhoods. So it's not just the plurality, there's not just the political preference that more people like than any other single preference. I like the idea. I mean, in my Toronto, we have lots on the left, we have lots on the right, we have lots of Greens, and I like the idea of a number of MPs representing districts of Toronto rather than single ridings with just one MP.
Okay.
I like that idea very much.
Okay, and actually when you're giving that explanation, I think that it was in the context of having 2 different types of MPs that you might have alluded there might be some sort of
and the constitutional issue.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, well,
so the question on that one, and it comes from Twitter from James Crown. He says that your brief states preference for STV, but he wants to know if MMP system with regional open lists, if that would fit the bill and avoid that constitutional issue.
Yeah. Well, again, we have this cloud hanging over us that the Supreme Court created a new kind of concept. Kenny alluded to it, of the architecture of the Constitution. And it's a little hard for those of us who parse every word of Supreme Court decisions to tell you, well, here's what architecture means. But I think my guess would be that if someone said having two kinds of MPs changes the architecture, they might get a case up. And it would be embarrassing to have a new electoral system under a constitutional cloud. I don't think you'd have that problem with STV. But I think there'd be an argument about constitutionality with MMP. That's all.
Okay.
It worries me.
Okay, and thank you for that. Professor Duthill, do you have any thoughts on systems that would maybe other, if you would be so bold,
well, I mean,
going beyond first past the post,
sure.
are there any other systems that we could be
I
looking
only see
at?
complications with the other systems. And at the end of the day, I'm not sure what they bring to the table. It's fundamentally different. So if you have a larger riding and you have three members of parliament for it, and all three of them from different affiliations, as opposed to one riding that has a member of parliament for it that is directly accountable, I do believe that for a lot of people, the MP's presence is important. I think it's one of the things that Canadians hold to most dearly. They may not support you personally. They may like the fact that they voted Liberal, they voted Conservative, they voted NDP, they voted Green, but they like the fact that you're there. At Ryerson, I started a program a few years ago that actually puts our students, our fourth-year students in politics, in your office. I may not be a part of that, but it's offered to all members of the GTA. And to answer your neighbor's question, I mean, how do we educate our students? That's one of the reasons. Yeah. That's one of the ways we do it. But I'm out of time.
Good, thanks, Mr. Reid.
Mr. Chair, I wanted to return to the question of political conventions and their strength in directing or mandating a prime minister who has indicated a willingness to override them. To do this, I just want to state what I believe the greatest danger to be, first of all, and then I'll turn to Albert Van Dicey, who discusses a particularly interesting parallel. As you know, in the 2015 election, the Liberal Party won 39% of the vote, but 54% of the seats, which gave it 100% of the power. Specifically, it won 184 seats. A calculation done based on that data and upon exit poll information as to the second, third, and fourth preferences of voters indicates that had they used a preferential ballot in single-member districts, the Liberals would have won 224 seats. Now that means, of course, they would have had something like 70% of the seats. But you can play this the other way. The question is, how low could their percentage of the vote drop and still allow them to get more than 50% of the seats and 100% of the power, given that that particular system predictably causes the party of the centre to do best? All right, that's the fundamental underlying issue, if that is the direction in which the Prime Minister steers. And he has indicated that so far that is the direction he plans to steer. So turning to conventions, Albert Van Dicey writes in the Introduction to the Study of the Law of the Constitution about the Septennial Act. This was an act passed in 1716 by the British Parliament, which at that time was elected for 3-year terms. The law changed the term of Parliament so that it could now continue to govern for an additional 4 years. It passed this one, it had a year left to go. And there was no court remedy against that act. And some members of the House of Lords protested and wrote at the time, or said at the time, the House of Commons must be chosen by the people, and when so chosen, they are truly the representatives of the people, which they cannot be so properly said to be when continuing for a longer time than that for which they were chosen. For after that time, they are chosen by Parliament and not by the people, who are thereby deprived of the only remedy they have against those members of Parliament. So that's the end of the quote. But you can see what I'm getting at. Effectively, Parliament rewrote the terms of its own contract unilaterally, gave itself extra power. The people had no remedy. Likewise, if Mr. Trudeau rewrites the election law so that the next election is conducted under rules under which he can lose a significant number of votes, then the classic test of a convention, which is, will it cost you the next election, is subverted. So I submit that question to you. What do we do with a situation where the issues of legitimacy are so clearly separated from the direction in which a government is trying to go?
I'll say this about what would likely happen in that kind of scenario. If the government unilaterally changes the rules by which Canadians elect their parliament, you are going to be setting, and if this is accepted, you are going to be setting a precedent where the next government can change the rules also. Simple as that. And we're going to wind up in a situation where potentially any government that's not happy with the result may roll the dice, change the system again. It may win big or may win less big. But I'd be concerned about that kind of situation. And again, in terms of providing what Canadians want, good, stable government that is flexible, that can be turfed out, I think that would raise cynicism. To come back to Mr. Thériault's question, that would raise cynicism a great deal more than anything else. So that'd be my worry.
I think it's a matter of legitimacy. I think looking for a convention, it may sound very erudite and intellectual. I just think it would be a bad idea to change the electoral system and not have a referendum. I mean, it could go down very badly with the Canadian people. But I think what you have to think about, and I'm sure you have to think about the referendum legislation. The Referendum Act you have now will not work. It was designed for the Constitution. It didn't apply to Quebec. You have to look very carefully at spending rules. You should look at the New Zealand referendum of 1993. Spending rules are absolutely crucial, and whether you're going to have yes and no teams, a lot of thought has to go into the referendum.
Thank you.
If you look at the 93 referendum in New Zealand, their second, the one they had after the 92, and corporate New Zealand just poured millions of dollars into hair-raising ads that it would be the end of civilization as you know it.
Okay, we'll have to go to Mr. Cullen.
If MMP went through.
Professor,
in the earlier election, the popularity of MMP was 86%, and it fell to 53%. With unlimited spending.
We'll have to go to Mr. Cullen now for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. I want to talk about the role of women in politics. There was a dramatic change in the last election in Canada, but no dramatic change in terms of women's representation in Parliament. The Parliament only changed 1%, in fact, of the total net. I'm looking through the list of countries in the world in terms of women's representation in the legislature, and Canada sits 62nd. I suppose we congratulate ourselves by not being 96th as the United States is, but 62nd is nothing to brag about. And I look through even the top 10, and there is one country that doesn't have a proportional representation system that is in the top 10 in terms of women's representation, but that's Cuba. So I'm not sure we're going to cite that example. Not exactly, Mr. Kenney, but there's a question about women's participation in proportional systems. The vast majority of countries that do well in terms of women participating are elected through proportional systems. Is this generally you asked for evidence earlier, so I'm trying to use it in this discussion today. Mr. Dutil, do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, there's absolutely nothing that prevents you in this system to running more women as candidates.
It seems to be.
There isn't. It's a choice you've made. It's a choice you've made.
Certainly within the parties. The NDP is coming through with 42% and the rest, but we have seen a barrier presented to women being successful in politics. Is that not fair? Because unless you agree that 26% representation is a good result, obviously the system is failing us to this point. The political parties, you can blame whoever you'd like. Blame the voters if you will.
No,
but
I'm going to blame the parties.
To suggest that the DNA, the actual mechanism in which people run as candidates and which they are elected to office is not a factor would be false, correct?
I think it's actually wrong to blame the system for political failures. You're blaming the system.
Not
you're
at
saying,
all. I'm asking,
you're saying that another system yields naturally more women.
Is there not a correlation?
I'll point you to another example.
I can't even follow now. So, well, why don't we let Mr. Dutil answer, and then you can have a supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll simply say that in Ontario, there's been a dramatic increase in the number of female MPs, and that's been done under a first-past-the-post system. I think it's real. If the parties are serious about making sure that women are well represented, then they should run more women as candidates.
I cited evidence that there's a correlation, it seems, at least on the surface, that under proportional systems, women do better. You agreed with that statement? Is that not true?
It's not. It's coincidence. It's not causal.
Coincidence. It's only coincidence that the vast majority of countries that succeed in having better women representation also are countries that have proportional systems. That's just coincidence. That's not evidence.
It's coincidence.
Right.
Run more women as candidates.
There was a question earlier about representing the will of voters. A question to you, Professor Russell. This one comes from Twitter from Jennifer Ross, who asked, do you think a referendum could be held after the voters have tried out and understand what the new system is? You've talked about not so much a convention, but validating the process that we are engaged in right now, hearing the democratic voice of Canadians through a referendum.
I would not go for a trial run. Okay. I really would go in town halls and other places to simulations. I think one of the best ways of getting people who haven't really thought much about these alternatives is to have simulations. It's the best way of teaching. When I've experienced this, but you stand up and you tell people, even though you have very clear language, what STV or some other system is, it goes in here and out there.
Sure.
If you take a Saturday afternoon off and you have a couple of votes, one under one system and one under other, not only do they learn something, they have a lot of fun.
And so this is
and do that. Have simulations.
We're trying to overcome is that barrier of fear of the unknown, or the fear of change, which is a natural precept. It was something about the outcomes again, and I think we need to return to this, because all we talk about here in terms of the mechanism, what I think in terms of understandability for Canadians is what kind of results are they going to see. My Conservative colleague earlier was attempting again to make a vice out of cooperation and coalitions and whatnot, which was strange because Mr. Harper in 2004 attempted to make what he didn't call a coalition government, he called it a co-opposition government. He used a different term when he sat down with Mr. Duceppe and Mr. Layton to try to oust the minority Liberal government. I remember it well too. I was here. So what's valid when it's introduced by one party becomes invalid. I think we need to make a virtue out of the idea of parties sharing ideas and sharing power. Is this not something that we should encourage?
Unfortunately, we're up. Our 5 minutes is up. Perhaps we could save the answer for another questioner. We'll go to Mr. Telliot.
Que de choses à dire.
So many things to say. You are inspiring, gentlemen. The question of regional vote or regionalism was raised by several stakeholders. It's a question that I ask myself as well. Some say that the current system provokes regional aberrations. For example, the one that occurred in 1995. I can come back to that. And the reason, and that's the reason we need proportional representation. Others think that they need a mixed member proportional system in order to, because that would favor the rise of regional votes. What do you think of that? A brief answer, because I have another question to ask. Experience would show that a proportional representation will lead to more parties that will represent narrower interests. It's that simple. In a proportional system, there will be more parties who will represent narrow interests. It's mathematically proven. Professor Russell.
I don't think it will. I think the sort of the opposite. I think it will encourage parties to be national. Right now, it's tempting for parties who runs consistently second or third to concentrate and don't get any representation in the House of Commons, to focus just on the region where they have strength. And that's always been a temptation. Fortunately, the Conservatives have resisted that temptation and has worked hard in Quebec, for instance, and to make themselves a national party. And the same with the Liberals, who almost got locked out of the West for a while. And I think a PR system would really encourage national parties. And the threshold level is very important. When you're taking your evidence in on other systems, we talked about the low threshold in the Israeli PR system. You should consider that. And you should look at the evidence of the proliferation of parties. It's not there. You should be evidence-driven. There are not big proliferations of regional parties in the countries that have adopted PR. And first-past-the-post countries have even more.
Je m'excuse de vous couper parce que là n'est pas mon.
I'm sorry to cut you off because that's not my point.
Vous amenez au juge Lebel que vous.
Wanted to talk about Justice Lebel, whom you quoted earlier. In his opinion, the current political system, the current federal system, is perhaps the most remarkable manifestation of the attachment to regional interests. And he quotes MacDonald about the Constitution. During debate on Confederation, absorbing the individuality of Lower Canada would not be in the interest of those peoples. There was no desire to lose their individuality as a nation. Would the vote from 1995 not be the manifestation of this willingness to not lose one's individuality as a nation? Do you think that's a representation of narrow interests?
Que la situation historique de 93.
I think that the historic situation of 1995, just like the historical situation of 1917, when Quebec manifested unanimously for Wilfrid Laurier, in both cases, this was a vivid reaction to an extraordinary political situation. Narrow, yes, in the sense that there was a response to a serious reality that required an almost unanimous vote, a reaction to see the parliamentary reaction to Quebecers' voices. What I would say about a proportional situation, I will guarantee you that in Canada we will see a regional party in every region. In Ontario, I will guarantee you that there will be parties that are sub-regional, that there'll be a Toronto party, that there'll be a Vancouver party. Thank you very much. We're now moving on to Ms. May.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
On something that, for Professor Russell, in testimony here yesterday, Professor Nelson Wiseman, whom I've seen you know, said there's really nothing new to learn about this. Just go back and look at the Law Reform Commission, look at the citizens' assemblies, and if the government were serious about electoral reform, this committee wouldn't exist. They would just have announced what they want to do, and we'd be doing it. Since you were an expert in the 2004 Law Commission report, Voting Counts, Electoral Reform in Canada, would you be willing to reflect on what you think we can learn that's new from 2004 to 2016? Or do you agree with Professor Wiseman that we should just go back and look at what other bodies have done?
Well, several things have happened since 2004. I mentioned the citizens' assemblies. I know they weren't all the Canadian citizens, but they were cross-sections, and they were extraordinary efforts to involve ordinary Canadians from all walks of life. You should look at their work. You should look at their report. They worked on it hard and thought it through. And that's new since the Law Reform Commission. I think we've got further evidence about the effectiveness of governments in countries with PR dealing with the fiscal crisis. I mean, 2008 was a tremendous challenge to the democracies. And if governments based on PR with minority parliaments, no party with a majority, according to the old bias, can't do anything, then how do you account for the very effective performance of minority governments and coalitions during the years of fiscal crisis, every bit as good as in countries with false majority governments. So we've got to, and I'd say the same on what I think is the biggest issue of our time, the environmental and issues in global warming. Again, I think the record of countries based on PR is very, very impressive. And we've mentioned, as Mr. Cohen did, the participation of women in elected legislatures has built up since 2004. So that argument, which was, by the way, put forward by the founder of Fair Vote Canada, the late Doris Anderson, as well as anyone, not to explain why it was not a coincidence, but why it happens, not just coincidentally, is still, in my mind, a tremendous bit of work, and that's got Fair Vote Canada going.
You don't, I mean, I would only say that there's been an explosion of studies over the last 10 years in terms of voting behavior. And most of it is showing that there is less and less of an obvious link between voting methods and the turnout rate. The turnout rate has gone up and down independent of the electoral systems that have been chosen. So there's more and more work that's been done over the last 10 years on this. They're looking at other factors. And the two factors that do seem to be making a difference, as I said in my opening presentation, are mandatory voting and voting on Sunday.
Yeah. And I do think that the statistics should still show an uptick of at least 6 to 7% in those countries that have PR. But I wanted to ask you a different question, Professor Dutil, and this is your article that appeared. I didn't see the thing in the Fraser Institute, but I did see the Toronto Star. And you said there that our electoral system has forced politicians to compromise. One of my beefs with First Past the Post, and particularly under false majorities, is that it does no such thing. I find that what governments, parliamentarians seem to want to do in recent years is find an issue that could be solved and deliberately not solve it. I'll give you the example of the long gun registry. The late Jack Layton had a proposal for solving the long gun registry through compromise. The governing Conservatives under Mr. Harper had no interest in that whatsoever because they saw in the long gun registry the classic wedge issue, that they could defeat decent MPs in their ridings if they made it a single issue campaign, that this MP or that MP hadn't stood up to kill the long gun registry, instead of fixing it wherein it was flawed. So I wonder if you'd comment on that. Doesn't First Past the Post encourage wedge issues?
I think we've hit the 5-minute mark, but you've made your point, and you know, go ahead for 10 seconds, please, because
there are wedge issues in every jurisdiction, and I really regret that. And it should have been fixed better, and I'm certainly not in agreement with the way things happened, but there was no, I mean, what is the political solution? I mean, should there have been an anti-gun party in a proportional system, maybe an anti-gun party that would hold the balance of power, would have fixed the issue right away? You get into all sorts of scenarios.
We got to go to Ms. Romanato, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, gentlemen. We've heard a lot over the last couple of meetings about our current system and the fact that the reality is it doesn't work. Millions of Canadians feel that their vote doesn't count, which adds to voter cynicism, low voter turnout, and so on and so forth. I myself, first time running, there were 7 candidates. I won with 35% of the vote. The reality is 65% of the population of Longueuil-Charlemagne did not vote for me. Now, post-election, I represent all 103,000 of them, regardless if they voted for me or not. However, how do we, in good conscience, say to the millions of Canadians who feel that their voices don't count under the current system that we should maintain the status quo because of the fact that we've always done it that way? We've been tasked to make sure that it is equitable, that folks feel that when they go to the ballot box that their vote counts. So I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on how we can, as a committee, make sure that those folks who are listening feel that we are, in fact, going to make sure that their vote counts.
I have to be blunt. I don't think that, I mean, I think this is a wrong image. Every vote counts. Every vote counts. Everybody's vote was counted. You came out first. And you know full well, that illustrates the point I made at the beginning, you know full well that most people voted against you, which makes you, I would expect, a much better member of parliament, because you are open to hearing what other people have said to you. It makes you more sensitive to the needs of the population. It makes you more sensitive to their difficulties with government. It makes sure that it makes you more aware of how your office back home can be helpful to them, regardless of how they voted for you. And I think this is what Canadians want. I think this is a fiction that their votes don't count. Every other system is going to have a system where their votes don't count. It could be PR. If you're going to raise the level at 15%, you're practically where we are now. If you're going to raise it, if you're going to lower it to 3%, then you're going to run a huge risk of having all sorts of regional and sectoral parties emerging. I don't think there's something wrong with you getting 35%. It may sound ugly, but at the end of the day, you're a good member of parliament. You're going to do a great job during the 4 years that you're there, and maybe you'll be defeated, and it's going to hurt. And I'm really sorry. I mean, I had an MP, a former MP, who came to my class, and I wanted her to talk about budgets, and she talked for an hour about how she was heartbroken by the fact that the voters turned her away, and did not vote for her party or for her. It wasn't personal. And thank goodness she's been reelected to Parliament, and she's one of your colleagues. She'll remain nameless. It's a hard thing, but Canadians want good, responsive government. They know your name. They know you're the MP. They know that no matter how you vote, they voted, because you don't know how they voted, you will serve them. And I'm sure you do, and I'm sure all of you do. And that makes for good government. That makes for good governance. And I think that our system has demonstrated that it can deliver on that. And to take a chance on another kind of system where you have a number of MPs for the local region and nobody really knows who's accountable to what, people know exactly if they have a problem with government, you're the one who's accountable. And you're the one who's going to have to fix it for them. And you're going to do the best you can, and if you can't, you're going to explain it why. So I wish you continued good luck.
Thank you. Professor Russell, any comments?
Well, with great respect to Fair Vote Canada, this expression, every vote counts, I don't think is a good slogan. You've just heard how it can be turned around. Because every vote is counted. And in a system of proportional representation, lots of votes, in a different sense, aren't counted. They're not represented in part. There have to be thresholds. So I don't rest my case for a proportional representation system on making every vote count. I don't think it's a good slogan.
Thank you. We have very little time left. If you have a statement, a 20-second statement you'd like to make, but I don't think we'll have time for an answer.
No, I just wanted to say, in terms of coalition or minority governments, do you feel that possibly having that collaborative approach would help diminish some cynicism?
Well, I think we have to go on to the. If we're going to finish more or less on time, we're going over as it is. Is it okay if we just leave that one out there for now? Thank you. But you did break some new ground on that. Every vote counts. Question I found. It's something we hadn't really talked about. Mr. Kenney.
Thank you, Chair. First a question on process, then on substance. On process, Professor Dutil, you've testified about the process followed by 3 provincial governments and in addition, the commitment by a former New Brunswick government to hold a referendum. In the cases of British Columbia and Ontario, the process involved citizens' assemblies that studied the issue and then framed a question that was referred to voters, which I think is analogous to the approach taken by New Zealand. In this case, we have eliminated the initial step, the intermediate step of a citizens' assembly. So now we have politicians discussing how politicians should be elected. And the government is seeking to eliminate the second step, which is a referendum to ensure democratic legitimacy or political legitimacy for the outcome. Don't you think at the very least we should have one of those 2 intermediate steps? Don't you think that many Canadians, regardless of their substantive views on electoral reform, I asked both witnesses, would find that politicians deciding, I mean, let's face it, in the context, as Professor Russell has testified the power of the Prime Minister's office. Let's face it, the ultimate decision at Cabinet will be made will reflect the Prime Minister's preference. Would it not be preferable, at least in terms of democratic legitimacy, to have either a citizens' assembly or a referendum or both?
How do you get cynicism? You get cynicism when politicians look after their own interests purely. That's the answer. People are going to turn cynical against politicians when they see that you're only defending yourself and your own personal interests or your own collective interests. It has to go to a referendum, whether you do it with a committee or with some sort of a electoral college or whatever. The people have to have the last word. If you want to defeat cynicism, then you have to show that it's not just about the incumbents protecting themselves. It's about opening up the system so that Canadians can voice their opinions on it. So I think that you have to do it. You have to do it. Now, in terms, I need to address this because it's been a subject of research of mine. This idea that the Prime Minister's office suddenly got stronger under Mr. Trudeau. I have a book coming out next year that demonstrates vividly that this goes back to Johnny Macdonald in 1867. The times have modernized, but the Prime Minister in this country has been very powerful from the get-go. It's nothing new. It's adapted to modern times, undeniably. Johnny Macdonald did it one way, Laurier did it one way, Borden did it one way, Mackenzie King did it one way. It's nothing new. Parliament's not going to change that. There are other ways that can perhaps contain the office of the Prime Minister. I think the Australians are teaching you guys a really good lesson when you have strong ministers, strong members of Parliament who can defeat their Prime Minister.
I've got to get my second question in.
Okay. Okay. Just on your referendum question, the proposal, I hope, is not the Prime Minister's. I hope it's a recommendation from this committee with a strong cross-bench consensus behind it. That's what the people of Canada want from you. They don't want just Justin Trudeau's preference. They want this committee's preference. And you've got a real obligation to take something to them that you really thought through and have a consensus on. They don't want a voting system that's just favorable to one party or two parties. They want one that's good for all Canadians. I just can't emphasize that too much.
Thank you.
And then you can have a decent referendum. But do look at the referendum rules.
In the past, I have been open to different kinds of electoral systems as being preferable to first past the post. I've never had a doctrinaire view about this, but I must confess to a certain degree of cynicism myself in this process, because the governing party, which has made no secret about the fact that it has a preferred outcome, which is a transferable vote. We're obviating a citizens' assembly, we're obviating a referendum, and as Mr. Reid pointed out, the results of the last, if the objective is for every vote to count, then that objective, we move in the wrong direction with a strict STV system, because under an STV system, it's estimated that the Liberal Party would have won 66% of the seats in the last election, as opposed to the 54% that it did. So could you comment on a single riding STV system, because the centrist party tends to win the second choice vote. So,
are you sure you're
under 15 seconds?
That's not a single member system. You're talking about
alternative vote. Was that what you're
alternative voting, preferential voting?
Yeah,
alternative votes.
Yeah,
that's a different.
Sorry,
yeah, that's got nothing to do with STV.
So, does not the alternative vote system end up meaning that actually fewer votes count than the status quo?
Please, because we're over time.
That is a possibility. The other possibility is that some people are going to have more votes than others. If you voted for one of the candidates that reached second or third position, your vote gets counted. But if you voted for somebody who's fallen lower on the calculations, that person gets to vote twice. They'll have their vote, and then they'll have their second vote counted.
Thank you, Mr. De Courcy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just looking for some clarity and perhaps to build a bridge between this idea of causality and coincidence with the way in which the electoral system precipitates the look of Parliament. Listening to, I think, all the other witnesses who have come before, they've said in one way or another that the current electoral system is one of a number of factors tied into a larger political culture including the way that Parliament operates, certain policies available to members in Parliament, as well as a number of other things that does factor into the way Parliament looks and feels to Canadians. Would you agree that the system is one of a number of factors that leads to the Parliament that we get?
Of course. I mean, the system is pivotal, and it's certainly one of the factors. But if you're looking for representation, I mean, I think you have to dig a little deeper. If you're looking for representation, you have to ask yourself as a party, are we running enough women? Are we running enough people that represent the country? This Parliament has made tremendous inroads. We have much greater representation of the Canadian population in this Parliament than ever. Not enough women, I grant you, and you're absolutely right. At the provincial level, we're doing a lot better. At the municipal level, not so much. But I think that it's a question of your own culture as a party, and you have to work towards that. But I don't think in terms of representation, I don't think the issue, I mean, yes, if you're going to run a list and you put a whole bunch of women on the list, you're dealing with a different kind of system. But you can also have that kind of system and have a lot of men on it. So, I mean, it's a choice you make as politicians. I mean, it really is it's really a political choice. And I think that political enlightenment, people might think of it as kind of idealistic. I still believe in political enlightenment. You represent this for me.
Professor Russell? Sorry, your view as to whether the system is one factor amongst a number of other factors?
Yeah, just very briefly, Mr. Chair, MMP, it is clearly easier for many women who have particularly domestic responsibilities to be list candidates than to do the very heavy-duty door knocking, which you people all know you have to do to be an MP elected from the constituency. You've all done that. And in STV, where you have, say, 5 for an urban district of Toronto or Montreal, then the party picks, the major parties pick 5 candidates for each of those seats, and that gives women a much better chance because they're very likely all the parties will want to have women evident on their lists, and that's also seen in both the Finnish system of STV and so on. So it's not just a coincidence. These systems seem to bring out more women, even in parties that are trying their darndest to get more women candidates.
Professor Russell, can I dig a little bit further there? Because I've heard other witnesses and other members talk about the lists in a potential MMP system still being drawn from candidates who have also run and done the door knocking, and that can lead to more legitimacy in the process. Would you share that view, or would you share the view that it's all right to just be on a list and receive
You know what you should do? You should look at some of these lists. Don't take it from me. And look at some of the lists on the German parties and the New Zealand parties. You see they put terrific people on there because they put stars on there. Outstanding people in the arts, even in sport, in business. Because the only constituency is not the geographic one. There are lots of, take Aboriginal people. That's a constituency in itself. One of the advantages of lists is you broaden the kind of representation you can have in Parliament. It doesn't all come down to geography. But take a look at the list. Don't just have a vague idea. You've got research from the Parliamentary Library, and they'll give you some samples.
Can I add one more line? I urge you to take a look at the Senate. Why not use the Senate as a house that would compensate for the distortions inside the House of Commons? Why not have more women in the Senate?
Okay.
Dictate to the Prime Minister.
No, you've made that point before, and it's a good one. Mr. Blakey.
I think because it's a committee on democratic reform, making recommendations about the Senate is just out of scope, but that might be one reason why we wouldn't do it.
The Senate is a house of parliament.
You know, when we talk about political enlightenment and, you know, political enlightenment being the way to get more women in politics, despite what I think is an obvious correlation, at least, which doesn't imply causality or coincidence between PR systems and the participation of women in politics. But then we switched to talking about a PR system and how we would have a proliferation of small parties and it would be unworkable. I wonder where the call to political enlightenment is there. If political enlightenment is an efficient way of delivering more women into politics, I don't see why, if we're capable of being politically enlightened in that sense under a first-past-the-post system, the same kind of goodwill and political enlightenment wouldn't mitigate towards less regional politics within a proportional representation system. So I've been struggling with the presentation of your concepts that are meant to do work. On the one hand, that is to get women into politics. We don't need any particular systems or rules about that. We're just going to do it because we're great politicians and we care about the country and this is important. Let's get it done. But under a PR system, all that political enlightenment and goodwill would evaporate. We wouldn't have it anymore, and we would just sort of revert to petty regional politics. I'm finding it hard to square your optimism about our capability as politicians with your pessimism about a proportional representation.
Thank you for the question. I think that under the system now, where you are elected with most people voting against you, it is incumbent on you to work hard and involve and be mindful of what people are thinking, and to do the best job you can, knowing that most people have voted against you. A PR system, a proportional representation, is fundamentally different. Parties are going to form because they represent a rather narrower perspective. But this is not just conjecture. Look at every jurisdiction that has used proportional representation, and you will see it. And you will see it in the Netherlands, and in Belgium, and in Spain, and in Greece. Everywhere that has used proportional representation, you will have parties that will emerge that will cater to a particular...
Yeah, so you have regional parties. I mean, you have regional parties under the first-past-the-post system. You had the Reform Party, which I think quite arguably was a regional party. It's why it had to engage in, the right had to come back together. And you have the Bloc Québécois, that's a regional party. So the idea that somehow we would be introducing regional parties to Canada because we adopted a proportional representation system is just...
Here's my point.
Wrong.
They are no longer there.
Well, I'm sitting beside someone from the
practically,
so
he's practically no longer there.
And
he's practically no longer there.
And I submit to you, there may be some reformers.
I really enjoy that.
Excuse me, they're not really gone.
Excuse me, Mr. Blakey. I really enjoy the back and forth, but can we keep it a little more linear? Like, go ahead. Who was speaking? Was it Mr. Dutil?
Mes excuses. Again, I'm simply pointing to the realities. In jurisdictions with PR, you're going to naturally have more people emerging to represent particular interests. And they're not interested in looking after other people's interests because they're guaranteed a certain percentage of the votes, and they're going to cater to that vote, and it will be reinforced. I mean, the great merit of the first-past-the-post system is that kind of behavior is not encouraged.
I'm going to claim my piece of the linear pie here, just to say that may well be true under a pure proportional system, but it's important not to. I mean, part of what we've been doing is hearing about the various kinds of proportional systems that you can bring in. Some of which include, so for instance, a mixed member system would include individual MPs potentially in individual ridings. Now, that's not the case for an STV system, but the idea that by adopting some kind of proportional system at all, you would have to abandon the idea that you will have local MPs that are held to that kind of account and maybe even elected with a plurality within their riding isn't incompatible with the idea you would have a system that overall, when you look at the Parliament, would be balanced out so that the views of Canadians are represented adequately and proportionally in their legislature. You don't have to. It's not a one or the other. So when you say a proportional system, part of the work of this committee is figuring out the extent to which you can't make that kind of general claim. And I'm sure, given your profession and your area of study, that you know that kind of general claim isn't possible. So I just don't see.
I wish you good luck.
I think the argument is too general.
People. I mean, the idea of having two classes of MPs, I don't think will jive with our political culture, where you have one class of MPs that will cater to the needs of the constituents, and another class of MPs that are always on the list, that are always going to be there. I think Canadians like to have their members of parliament accountable. And when it's time for the party to go, when it's time to defeat the government, the Canadians know exactly what lever to pull.
But for demographic
okay, we had a really good
you like the
exchange.
idea of
We had a
using
really good
senators
exchange,
who
Mr.
aren't
Blakey, and I'm
accountable to
sure
anyone.
Mr. Deltel will also regale us with a very good exchange.
So much, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I'm very happy to be here. I can assure this committee that the Bloc Québécois is still there. I can assure that. And for our part, yes, we have different routes, maybe, and I'm very proud to show in this House my member card of 1981 of the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada when I was 17 years old. So I'm very proud of my roots. I'm very proud to be conservative, too. Like, I'm sure you're proud to be NDP, you're proud to be Green, you're proud to be Bloc Québécois, and you're proud to be Liberal. Dr. Russell, you said, Doctor, you're a PhD, Professor Russell, you said that you wish that this committee will make a recommendation and the government will follow this recommendation. This is what you said. Well, sorry for you, pal, but this will not be the case. Because a few weeks ago, exactly the same place, the same room, and she was sitting there on your chair. The minister said she's not attached to the decision of this committee.
Oh.
So at the end of the day,
I didn't know that.
At the end of the day, the shot would be called by one guy, the Prime Minister, who controls the cabinet, who controls the majority of the House. So don't you think it will be a necessity to have a referendum, so let the people decide instead of the call of one guy.
Yes, even more necessity to have a referendum in that situation. But I have to look into what Minister Moussef said. I will do that and see if it's as crystal clear as you suggest. If it is, I'd be extremely disappointed. I have to catch a plane to get to a boat. And I don't want to be rude, but I think I must make my departure. Yes, plane, boat, yes. So please forgive me for leaving
we understand, but we really appreciate your testimony here today.
Thank you
We're
very
almost
much.
done, and we have Professor Dutil who will answer remaining questions. Thanks again for coming, Professor Russell.
Well, I'm very pleased that I made a statement before Mr. Russell left. I'm very surprised to see the Green leader with him. I'm very surprised. So, Mr. Dutil, j'aimerais parler avec vous de l'importance de consulter.
Mr. Dutil, I'd like to speak with you about the importance of consulting citizens. The government has asked us to hold townhouse meetings to consult with people. In your opinion, is this a good way to know what the people of Canada think, holding townhouses, as compared to a referendum where we could consult with all Canadians? No. The answer is no. Because it's not representative. The people who are going to go to these town halls are, generally speaking, people who are in favor of change, who want change. Those who are satisfied with the system, and that's the great majority of Canadians, won't go out of their way to participate in this kind of exercise. They'll be rare, those who would. So, no. If we truly want to have the confirmation that this is really what the people of Canada want, we need a referendum. In my opinion, it's absolutely necessary. And what do you think of those who say that a referendum, well, we might risk losing it, so we won't do it? Well, it's up to them. It's up to them to defend their position, to convince people in a referendum campaign to defend their position and to prove to Canadians that what they favor is a system that is better than the one that we've had for 225 years. So it's up to them to convince us, it's up to them to convince Canadians of that, and I wish them good luck. And in a referendum campaign, which is fair, which will allow people to choose, as was done in New Zealand, as it was done in Australia, in Great Britain, it will also give people the choice of saying, I prefer the current system. So the question must be incredibly clear. It must give Canadians the choice of keeping the status quo. If those conditions are brought together, then I think we can have a good referendum whose result would be respected. Well, you have about 40 seconds left. All right, well, I would just like to go back to what I've said a couple of times already, is that people, generally speaking, don't talk to me about the last election or the beginning of the mandate. Since the committee's been sitting, nobody's talked to me about this. The only time people talk to me about this committee and electoral reform is when I bring it up. So there are political activists who have their role to play in our democracy, are speaking out, but this is not something that's concerning average Canadians, and a referendum must be held. All right, we'll finish with Ms. Sahota.
No, I'd actually get the opportunity. My question was framed more in terms of Mr. Russell's, Professor Russell's work, but perhaps you can also comment, Mr. Dutel. I wanted to learn a little bit more about the Jenkins Commission and the process they undertook. Is that something that you're familiar with? If not, then I can rephrase.
Jenkins?
The UK Commission. I know that Mr. Russell had looked into that a little bit as well when they also
Depends on
went
your
through
question.
the process. They also went through the process of looking into reforming the electoral system, and if you could comment on their outcome. They had looked a lot into AV+. That's a system that we haven't really talked a lot about. We've been looking at STP.
You know, quite frankly, I didn't follow the results of that commission closely. What I followed was the referendum that was held afterwards, and that's what mattered to me. I think the British did it correctly. They organized a committee. They put the question to the people, and they got the result. Can I respond to the question you asked Professor Russell, and I didn't get a chance to talk. I think you asked a question about what can we do, or it might have been your neighbor, to better connect MPs to their constituents.
It was my question.
There are two things that I've been aware of. And because I spearheaded them. One of them was the Parliament to Campus program that was run by the former Parliamentarians Association. And unfortunately, that program was cut off because of lack of funding a few years ago, but I ran it as a director for 3 years. And my job was to bring former members of Parliament to university campuses and to share with students in politics the life of the MP. And one of the motivations there was to get people to understand the role of the MP, of the local MP, and what they do, and to entice younger people to consider a career in politics. That's one thing. The second thing, as I mentioned earlier, was that at Ryerson, I started a program where we place students in members of Parliament's offices for a credit. They work with you for a day, a week, during 10 weeks, and they write a paper about it, and they get a credit for it. It's unique in Canada, but again, if you want to build awareness of the very important role you play, sometimes it has to be done one by one, but these kids are fantastic, and it's a great way of motivating people. Can I ask a third thing? I want to bring it out a little bit, if I have a second. Samara Canada, we talked about Samara earlier, has put together a pilot project where they get together with recent arrivals to Canada, and they teach them about our political system. We know that recent immigrants do not tend to participate, once they've become citizens, do not tend to participate in elections. It's one of the reasons why the rate is a bit lower. This is, again, a great project that could be continued with proper funding to help those new arrivals, new Canadian citizens, learn more about our system. So there are a lot of things that can be done without changing the system to better educate Canadians about their political life and political institutions.
I think those are great ways to engage our population. I've definitely participated in similar programs where at the high school and university levels. And we've heard from other witnesses that teaching this in schools, and Mr. Russell was talking about it, and having these types of programs at a young age. You tend to engage them at that age, then they'll become lifetime.
Absolutely fundamental. And again, Professor Russell did indicate that Ontario is one of the few provinces that has a civics course and required in high school. Ontario is one of only 4 provinces that teaches history in high school. We have a lot of work to do to educate our population about the institutions that govern us. And I think that again, is something that needs to be addressed. Now, again, from a federal perspective, it's obviously difficult, but you can also make an argument that needs to happen also.
Absolutely. Thank you.
30 seconds.
Well, I just want to thank you for all your testimony here today, and it was quite enlightening.
Effectivement, merci beaucoup de votre présence, d'avoir été des nôtres.
Thank you, Professor Dutil, for being with us today. It's been a lively debate, and we've learned quite a bit from today's discussion. I would like to remind members of the committee that we will be meeting this evening at 7 o'clock in C110, room C110, at 1 Wellington. And we will hear representatives via video conference from the electoral commissions of New Zealand and Australia. Thank you very much for your cooperation, and we will see you later this evening. This meeting is adjourned.
Did we say on Thursday?